So I assume by today's attendance that either people are taking an early Thanksgiving or they're still in mourning over the big game, or both. Okay, I want to, before we get started, one announcement I want to make. I posted problem set number 6 and I sent you all an email, and I took problem set 6 down because I need to make a change to it. So if you've downloaded it already and you've started, the change is going to be the multiple choice, to the free response question. So the multiple choice are there. You can go ahead and work on those if you want, and I'll try and have a new free response question for you tomorrow. The other thing I want to do before we get started with today's lecture is unfreeze the brain freeze that I had last week when we did this diagram. Sometimes, and you'll find this when you get to be my age, the synapses sometimes just don't synapse. Several of you were trying to tell me exactly what the correct answer was, and it just wasn't registering in my brain, and I apologize for that. But you may recall I ended up with this payout matrix, and indeed the lower right-hand quadrant is incorrect. So, and I was going on about partial analysis in general. Who knows? Sometimes brains just don't work that well in the afternoon. It's very clear that if the U.S., what we did was if the U.S. were to put on an optimal tariff and China did nothing, the U.S. would have a small gain, China would have a big loss. If China put on an optimal tariff, then it would have a small gain, and if the U.S. had not put on any tariff, it would have a large loss. Those are what we see in the upper right-hand corner quadrant and the lower left-hand quadrant. If both countries put on optimal tariffs, then they have a small gain in the product in which they're using the tariff on, but they're also experiencing a large loss because the other country has put a tariff on. So here, we've got to think about both the gain from the optimal tariff that's being imposed, but also the loss that's being imposed by the other country's tariff. So it turns out neither of these are small gains. Both of these are moderate losses. Yeah, that doesn't look very good, does it? Let me swing this screen around. It'll be maybe a little easier for me to write on. Now, the key here is that the size of the losses that are occurring when both countries put on tariffs is a smaller loss than if you weren't putting on the tariff. So the losses that we see here are smaller than the loss here, and it's smaller than the loss we would see up here. So now when you look at what is the best decision for each country, what we see for the U.S. is if China does not put on a tariff, the U.S. should. If China does put on a tariff, the U.S. still should put on a tariff, because a moderate loss is still better than a large loss. Same thing would be true for China. China should always put on a tariff regardless of what the U.S. does. In that case, this lower right-hand quadrant still turns out to be the Nash equilibrium. So notice that even though free trade, no tariff on either part, would give a higher level of economic welfare, or at least no diminution, what we end up with is both countries putting on tariffs and both countries losing because of that. Now notice that's a very similar outcome to what we saw in, I think, problem set number 5, right? The strategic trade problem, where both Boeing and Airbus would produce, both lose money, rather than both not produce and have no losses but also no gains. So it's sometimes, even when you see the payout matrix, what seems most logical in terms of an outcome isn't actually the outcome of the game that's being played between the two countries. And that's the situation we have here. So other than the fact that I got this stuff all messed up, everything else we said in terms of conclusions was still the same. So I apologize for that. But okay, so today we want to, and Monday, or I guess Monday, it won't be Monday, today, what's today? Tuesday. Next Tuesday, we're going to talk a little bit about some controversial issues in international trade, almost all of which have to do with the World Trade Organization. So remember that the World Trade Organization is that entity that actually kind of sets the rules and regulations for how international trade is actually conducted. So we want to talk about a number of those issues, and if I can find my other piece of technology. So including things like wage rates and labor standards and national independence or sovereignty in particular. One of the things that we've seen and talked about is that over the last 25 years, as developing countries have sort of moved away from import substituting industrialization and moved more towards export-oriented industrialization, that we've seen a change in the composition of the exports from developing countries, away from primary and agricultural products and more towards manufacturing products. Now, one of the other things that we can notice in that is that manufacturing products are paid at a very different and much lower rate, and working standards are much worse. Okay, so one of the issues that comes up a lot in discussions of international trade, especially between developed and developing countries, is this whole notion of not only the working standards that these people were working in, but also the wage rates that they're paid. And indeed, if you look at the wages that were paid to these fellows in this particular slideshow and compared them with wages that were paid for people who used to be making manhole covers in the United States, you would have seen a huge dramatic difference, right? I mean, that's not probably terribly surprising for a whole host of reasons. So that becomes an issue that has developed in terms of globalization. So one of the things that we have to ask ourselves are really low wages in developing countries a cause for concern? So from a purely economic perspective, what we would say is if the international trade, if the economic activity is truly voluntary, then of course what's going on is a mutual exchange. And we know that in mutually voluntary exchanges, both parties benefit. So yes, those look like really terrible working conditions for us, but again, assuming that the workers are not being forced to work under those kinds of conditions, forced in the sense of against their will, then this kind of activity should indeed be mutually beneficial to both parties. The other issue, though, that we know, again, from an economics perspective, if we thought back to the Heckscher-Ohlin model in particular, is that labor-abundant countries who are producing labor-intensive products should, in fact, see the return to labor rise, and, in fact, rise pretty quickly. So that's what the Heckscher-Ohlin model says, and there's ample evidence that that does happen. It doesn't happen immediately, because many labor-abundant countries, of course, have a huge oversupply of workers. And so it's only when those workers are moving into the industry, begins to draw down some of the oversupply, and we start to see at least relative labor shortages, that those wages start to rise pretty quickly. So if we were to look at the example of manufacturing activity in southern China, what we would have seen is from 1995 to the early 2000s, even though exports of manufactured goods from that part of China were growing very dramatically in labor-intensive goods, the wages paid to workers were not rising particularly quickly. But from roughly 2002 to 2003 until more recently, wages in that part of the country, that part of China, have actually been growing quite dramatically, in the neighborhood of almost 20% per year for the last 8 years. So again, it shows that once you start to use up some of the excess labor supply that's available to move into this industry, the labor-abundant, the labor-intensive industries, that we should see an increase in the returns to workers, and that should also allow us to increase overall national income. So at least from a theoretical perspective, we've got some answers for, yeah, it may look terrible from our perspective, but we have to realize that perhaps this is part of the process of development. So when we think about some of the critics of globalization looking at this, one of the arguments is that workers are actually really worse off in this. First of all, the highly paid jobs in the developed countries are lost, right? So we've got relatively highly paid jobs in labor-intensive products in high-income countries that are lost. That's happened in the United States and in Western Europe and in Japan. The most obvious example is in things like textiles, clothing and apparel. It's also fairly apparent in low-end manufacturing. Almost none of that type of activity takes place in Western Europe, United States, Canada, or Japan anymore, right? It's all migrated to labor-abundant, low-wage developing countries. So these jobs are lost, and they're lost to workers making much less. In addition, it can be argued that the workers in the developing countries are in fact underpaid. Right? They're doing exactly the same work that the workers were in the United States or Western Europe or the other developed countries, but they're being paid dramatically less, sometimes on the order of only 10% of what a worker was being paid to produce the similar product in a developed country. So we've got jobs being lost in the high-income countries, and we're underpaying workers in the low-income countries. Well, you may remember, you probably don't, maybe you don't, hopefully you remember, way back when we talked about the Ricardian model. That's a long time ago, wasn't it? Week 2. So one of the things that we showed in the Ricardian model, though, is that where wages are going to settle is going to depend upon the productivity of the workforce. And the productivity of the workforce depends upon lots of different things, including how much capital each worker has to work with. If you look at the production process that we used in the United States to make manhole covers, as an example, as opposed to the production process that we saw here in this slideshow, we would see something very, very different. In this particular show, it shows lots of workers, not a lot of capital equipment. I got furnaces, I got a lot of mold and stuff, but not a lot of capital equipment. If you had looked at a foundry in the United States, what you would have seen is many fewer workers and lots of capital equipment. So labor productivity, the amount of output per worker, was dramatically higher in developed countries than it is in developing countries. That doesn't mean that the developed country would have a comparative advantage. Clearly it didn't. And that's why the activity moved to the labor-abundant, low-wage country. Remember, one of the reasons low-wage countries are low-wage is because they are labor-abundant, right? If you have a huge supply of any factor of production, the rate of return to that factor of production is likely to be relatively low. So we can also talk about the purchasing power of the wages. And again, in the models that we looked at earlier, Ricardian model, Heckscher-Ohlin, not so much the specific factors, but in the broader sort of standard trade model, one of the things that we pointed out was that the purchasing power of the factors of production, at least in the long run, not always in the short run, as the specific factors model showed us, but in the long run, the purchasing power of the factors of production improves. Either their return rises more quickly than the products that they're producing and exporting, or their returns are rising where the relative price of imported products is falling. So the purchasing power is actually improving by this rearrangement of production to more optimal or efficient sources. We also need to think, when we worry about low wages being paid in developing countries, as the critics of trade, focusing on the international trade aspects of those low wages, we also need to remind ourselves of what are the alternatives for workers in those countries. Now, I can tell you, if it were up to me and I were living in India, I don't want to work in a metal foundry, right? That looks just absolutely awful. But whether I would or not might depend upon what my alternatives would be. So let's look at another, let's see. Okay, how do we do that? Oh, come on. Okay, where are you? No, don't do that. Okay. Oh, come on. Yes, of course. So you may know that the United States has negotiated trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, South Korea. It's one other country I can't think of right now that have not yet been ratified. And in all of those trade agreements, one of the stumbling blocks actually has to do with labor standards, working conditions, not so much wages, but working conditions themselves. So one of the things that we ought to think about at least a little bit is, to what extent should trade agreements, not trade, but trade agreements, to what extent should trade agreements include issues like wage rates, labor standards, working conditions, any of those types of things. So it might be things like occupational health and safety issues, what we call OSHA here, child labor laws. At what point do we think that children shouldn't work? And is that a legitimate area for a trade negotiation to go into effect, where we are going to give some other trading partner a preferential tariff? Things like minimum wages or the rights to organize. You can think of other issues as well. typically we see two groups of people who are sort of pushing for labor agreements to be included, in trade, or labor standards to be included in trade agreements. One is consumers who, as Nicholas Kristof said, are sometimes outraged knowing about the kind of working conditions that some of the things that they're buying are actually produced in. And there's no doubt that in many parts of the world, it's pretty horrible. Policymakers, reflecting the view of consumers, also sometimes push for labor standards. As he said, this is one of the areas that President Obama has been pushing for. By the way, it was also one of the things that President Bush was pushing for in the trade negotiations that they went through. And it was also some of the things that President Clinton was pushing for when he was in office, and also some of the things that President Bush, the first one, was pushing for when he was in office. And in fact, some of the things that they were talking about in trade negotiations when Ronald Reagan was president. So this whole notion that you may come away from listening to that video thinking that President Obama is the first chief executive to push for these kinds of standards, but in fact, this has been something that's been promoted for a long time. A second group, or the second major group that pushes for labor standards, have actually been unions. And unions have pushed this, in some sense, as a solidarity movement with workers in the rest of the world. Here in the United States and in Western Europe, Canada, and Japan, labor unions have the right to organize and have the right to negotiate all sorts of different kinds of working conditions and wage rates and elsewhere. In other parts of the world, that's not so true. There are lots of places where labor unions can't operate, or labor unions can operate only under government auspices, and they don't have any independent right to strike or to really negotiate from any position of power with businesses for wages, working conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So that may be one of the issues, or labor unions are one of the constituencies arguing for this as well. Now, one should be careful here too, because of course workers in industrialized or developed countries would also stand to benefit if the comparative advantage of labor-abundant countries was weakened by having, as he suggested, higher cost. So in the video on Cambodia, where he was talking about the one manufacturing facility where they actually had upgraded some of the working conditions, which also raised cost, some of those jobs were now migrating to other countries. Now, this can be a cause of concern, and critics have referred to this as the race to the bottom. Let's get down to, my goodness, where's the cheapest labor on earth? And let's put manufacturing there. Kristof would argue, and I think many international trade economists would argue, that would be just fine. That would be the best anti-poverty movement we could do for the poorest countries of the world. Because once their relative abundancy begins to be used in export-oriented industries, now all of a sudden the rate of return to labor is going to start to rise. And so that may very well be a way of moving down into the poorer and poorer countries of the world, but it's also a way of raising their living standards from abject poverty to just deep poverty. Still poverty. I don't want to live there, but those are some of the things that can happen. Now, the strongest statement that can be made, and this has been tried, the U.S. tried to include this in our trade negotiations with Colombia, was having very formal labor standards. In Colombia, in particular, there's been a lot of violence against union leaders, and unions in the U.S. put a lot of pressure on the administration, the George Bush administration, to include strong labor standards in those negotiations. In general, however, the developing countries push back on formal labor standards, arguing that they should be able, under rights of national sovereignty, to determine what labor standards are for their particular country, and that those labor standards should not be imposed upon them from outside. So in the United States, for instance, where we argue child labor laws would say you can't go to work until you're 16, with few exceptions. In other parts of the world, that's obviously not the case. Well, should we use our bully pulpit just because we don't allow children to work to say that that should also be the case in other countries? Other countries, of course, would say just the opposite. As you saw in the garbage dump in Cambodia, there were lots of children scavenging in that dump. And if you travel any part through most of the developing world, you'll see children hawking vegetables in marketplaces or other types of things to almost anybody who looks like they have money. So a more modest step, rather than having formal labor agreements, which would in some sense pull those labor standards out of trade negotiations completely, would be to have some sort of way of monitoring wage and working conditions, not comparing them with what happens in the developed world, but actually comparing them with what happens in other industries within the country. Remember, when we talk about labor standards in trade negotiations, it's labor standards in the export industries of those developing countries, not the non-traded goods sector of the economy, which is where the vast majority of workers will actually be in any event. So when we're looking at those labor standards and working conditions and wages and so forth in the export-oriented industries, maybe the comparison shouldn't be against developed country standards, but what are we seeing in other parts of that developing country's economy, or perhaps even in other developing countries at a similar stage of production and openness to international trade? So a fair amount of this actually now does take place. And it can take place under lots of independent monitors, generally NGOs, non-governmental organizations. But in a monitoring and reporting type of system, consumers have responsibilities, corporations have responsibilities, and countries have responsibilities. The first, in terms of the consumer responsibilities, is we actually need to educate ourselves about what's going on. And we need to decide as consumers whether or not we would be willing to pay higher prices for products that are made under certain better working conditions, which are also higher cost conditions, as opposed to buying cheaper products made under less desirable conditions, even in foreign country. So that's something that needs to obviously take place. What most of the surveys show, and actually what most of the evidence shows, is that consumers are willing to pay a little bit more, but not significantly more, to improve working conditions abroad. Corporate responsibility. So corporations also have to try and get the word out. And this is the word